Wonders of Grace. Emma Sophia Sutherland. And this is what Emma wrote, and I quote, "I was first impressed when aged 3 from the circumstance of a neighbor dying. I became restless and afraid of death. I resolved to attend church 3 times every Sabbath. At 16, I was confirmed. My father bought me Pilgrim's Progress. I read it with delight and found at the foot of the cross my burden dropped off. I always thought I must do something to be saved. At 18, I married my father's clerk against the will of my parents. He pretended to be very religious, but it was only put on. After I was married, he threw off the mask. My grief and suffering with him was very great. I have been separated from him 2 years last October. I have heard Mr. Spurgeon 6 months. From his preaching I've been more enlightened. I see the way of salvation clearly. I feel joy and peace in believing. I have sweet fellowship with Jesus. I wish to be baptized and join the church." End of quote. Think this is a good case, and gave her a card. Signed, John Barrow. Alfred Catchpool. And this is what Alfred wrote, and I quote, "About 3 months ago, since I became deeply impressed from my father's prayers, up to this time I had determined to have my fill of pleasure and went into it. I despised my father's evening prayers and longed for them to be over. But now I became impressed. I could not rest. I was afraid to pray, and yet I could not help it. I knew if I then died, I was lost. I sought mercy. I heard Mr. Spurgeon from, 'The love of Christ constraineth us.' I felt I could give myself wholly to him. Then I could pray and trust in him with all my heart." End of quote. This is a babe, but I believe he will become a man, and a man in Christ. We must nurse him and give him the bread, and he will thrive. I have much pleasure in giving him a card to our pastor. Signed, John Barrow. And then he adds, "The father had best be consulted, and the best time sought for the visitors to see him, as he is not home until well after 10 at night." Mary Ann Mornings. About 2 years since, she had very deep affliction in the loss of 2 children and her husband. After this, herself brought very low by typhoid fever. These were the means in the hands of the Lord of leading her to see her lost state as a sinner. She wanted to pray but could not. The verse, "I can but perish if I go, I am resolved to try," was much blessed to her. She read the sermon on the smoking flax, and this led to deliverance. She heard Mr. Spurgeon regularly until the calamity at the music hall, and she was there much injured internally and was confined to her bed for months, and her life despaired of being given over by the doctors. I visited her several times, and she then resolved that if able to get up again, she would consecrate herself to the Lord in baptism. It is a good case. Gave her a card. Signed, George Moore. And then adds, "Brother Frank has visited this case also several times. To God be the glory."